Brian Hooker's GPS trail changed the search for Lynette Hooker. For weeks, the public version of this case centered on a claimed accident in the Sea of Abaco. Lynette Hooker allegedly falling from a dinghy, Brian Hooker drifting away, and rescuers searching the water based on that account. But now the focus has shifted to GPS locations from Brian's devices, Soulmate, and the places where investigators are searching. That shift matters because the United States Coast Guard, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, the Bahamian Police, and the Royal Bahamian Defense Force are no longer just following a story, they are following data. And the data, as described by investigators and sources in the case, appears to point somewhere else. If you want every major development in this case, follow this investigation closely. The central question is no longer just where Lynette Hooker went on April 4th. It is why the route now being examined does not appear to match the route Brian Hooker described. The last known evening began at the Abaco Inn, where Lynette and Brian reportedly had drinks from 4:30 to 7:30. The Abaco Inn matters because it is the last social setting before the account that has driven this entire investigation. A return trip by dinghy, a sudden fall, separation in the water, and Brian Hooker eventually reaching Marsh Harbor. But the current search tells a different story. The Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norville arrived with a dive team, investigators, agents, the Broward County dog Maggie, and Maggie's handler Chris. From there, teams moved into the Sea of Abaco using a rigid inflatable boat with support from Bahamian vessels. There were two tracks to the search. One track was underwater, divers, sonar, and an ROV, a remote-operated vehicle. The other was on land. Maggie and search teams moving through beaches, mangroves, and secluded areas near Serenity, White Sound Channel, and the west side of Lobers. That matters because search teams do not randomly move major resources after nearly 8 weeks. They move when something tells them to move. In this case, what reportedly told them to move was GPS data. Brian Hooker is not charged with anything. That has to remain clear. But authorities are treating Lynette Hooker's disappearance as a suspected murder investigation, and the work now underway is broader than a standard recovery search. The source material describes investigators looking at places where Brian's devices allegedly placed him, including locations where he reportedly said he had not been. That is the first major contradiction. The second is Soulmate. Soulmate is the sailboat Brian and Lynette Hooker lived aboard. It was later seized by the Coast Guard approximately 40 miles off the coast of Florida, while commercial delivery captains were bringing it back from the Bahamas. Crime scene tape was later seen around the vessel, and investigators reportedly removed items and processed evidence. If Lynette simply fell from the dinghy, why did Soulmate become such a central focus? That question has not been fully answered, but the dive activity gives part of the picture. Investigators reportedly planned to search around the location where Soulmate was anchored. A witness on land, roughly 100 yards away, reportedly heard a large splash at about 9:30 at night. That does not prove what happened. It changes what must be checked. The search also moved to an abandoned harbor north of Witch Point, near the east side of Marsh Harbor. This was not a clean dock or a beach where someone would naturally seek help. It was an area with old boats, barges, concrete openings, shallow water, debris, and places difficult to inspect without specialized equipment. Divers went into that area. The ROV searched there. Sonar was part of the effort. At one point, divers used what locals called a conch hammer to break through part of an old barge, apparently to gain access below or allow equipment to see into a closed space. That is not routine sightseeing. That is targeted search work. And it was not only Lynette Hooker investigators were reportedly looking for. They were also searching for the dry bag, the oar, clothing, and anything that could confirm or contradict Brian Hooker's account. The dry bag matters because Brian's story placed critical items with Lynette. The oar matters because his account involved losing one while trying to manage the dinghy. The search for those objects is a search for the truth of the timeline. At first, the case seemed to rest on a grim but simple account. A woman overboard, a husband unable to reach her, a dinghy drifting toward Marsh Harbor. Then came Carly Ellsworth. Carly Ellsworth, Lynette's daughter, described the call she received after her mother disappeared. She said Brian Hooker told her Lynette had fallen overboard, that he tried to throw something to her, and that she had been missing since the night before. But Carly raised a problem with that account. She said the item described to her as a life preserver was not really a life preserver. She described it as more like a seat cushion. She also said there were 2 life jackets still in the dinghy. 2 life jackets. Unused. And according to Carly, the water where Lynette was said to have fallen was shallow enough that her mother could have swum only a short distance and stood up. That does not settle the case, but it makes the accident account harder to accept without more evidence. Did the unused life jackets in Brian Hooker's dinghy point to panic, or to a story investigators still need to test? Do not miss the next piece of evidence. The timeline has another pressure point. Brian Hooker reportedly reached the boatyard around 3:35 in the morning. That boatyard became one of the first places where he encountered another person after the alleged 9-hour drift. But the behavior described in the source material is not what some people expected from a man who had just lost his wife at sea. Security video was described as showing him moving quietly, looking around, and asking for help without obvious urgency. That is an allegation based on a described video, not a conviction. Still, investigators went back to the boatyard. Why would they do that? Because the boatyard may not simply be where the story ended. It may be part of the route that has to be reconstructed. The same is true of the Abaco Inn. The Abaco Inn became a staging point for vessels and a meeting place involving the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, the Royal Bahamian Police Force, and the Royal Bahamian Defense Force. From there, teams dispersed to search areas across the Sea of Abaco. The geography matters. The Abaco Inn, White Sound Channel, Serenity, Marsh Harbor, Witch Point, Soulmate, the west side of Lobers. Those are not background details. They are the map. Then there is the missing physical evidence. The dry bag has not been found. The oar has not been found. A previously located oar was reportedly determined not to be the one investigators were looking for. On May 22nd, boaters reportedly saw an article of clothing offshore on the west side of Lobers in about 4 to 5 feet of water. They marked coordinates and sent them in, but when the location was later searched, the clothing was no longer there. That is one of the most frustrating details in the case. A possible item appears in an area of interest. Coordinates are saved, but the object is gone by the time searchers arrive. Again, that does not prove it belonged to Lynette Hooker. It only shows why the west side of Lobers remains important. Investigators also obtained dental records from Lynette's family, and Lynette's daughter, Lynette's mom, and Lynette's dad reportedly provided DNA samples. Carly Ellsworth, Darlene, and Dan are not just names in this case. They are now part of the identification process if remains or biological evidence are found. That is the quiet reality of the search after 7+ weeks. They are looking carefully, clinically, and with the knowledge that time changes what can be recovered. But the strongest contradiction may come from the electronic record. The source material describes Soulmate going dark for 11 hours, from about 9:30 p.m. on April the 4th until 8:40 a.m. on April the 5th. During the very window investigators most need movement, speed, and location data, the vessel's tracking was reportedly unavailable. That alone would be significant, but it sits next to another reported issue: GPS evidence from Brian Hooker's devices. The investigation reportedly identified locations that did not align with his original statements. The search then moved to previously unsearched areas of the Sea of Abaco. The story appeared to be about drift. Then investigators started following devices. And when that happened, the case moved from one version of the water to another. That is the central break. If a person drifts helplessly, the route should look like a drift. If electronic data shows something else, investigators have to ask why. The recorded explanation attributed to Brian Hooker contains several elements investigators appear to be testing: wind, waves, the dinghy key, the dry bag, the oar, the anchor, darkness, and separation from Lynette. Each element has consequences. If the dinghy had no propulsion, the landing pattern matters. If the current and wind moved Brian, the cushion or float should be assessed against the same forces. If Lynette had the dry bag should eventually matter. If the oar broke and vanished, that object becomes evidence. If a witness heard a splash near Soulmate, the water around Soulmate matters. And if the GPS locations from Brian's devices place him somewhere inconsistent with the drift story, then the entire timeline has to be rebuilt from the ground up. Brian Hooker is still not charged with anything. That sentence must stay in the script because presumption matters. But presumption does not prevent investigators from asking hard questions. It is also why search teams were looking in places like the abandoned harbor north of Witch Point, the west side of Lobers, the area around Soulmate, and the boatyard. They are not searching the idea of a story, they are searching the physical world. There are also allegations around the relationship that remain sensitive and must be treated carefully. Jordan Plintz, a neighbor, described hearing from Darlene that Lynette had stayed away from the relationship before. Vanessa Walsh described a social media posting gap after March 10th, and a one-way plane ticket, Lynette's mother said, was scheduled for March 11th, though the source material does not confirm what happened during those 9 days. Those details are not proof of what happened on April 4th. They are context investigators may consider. Carly Ellsworth also discussed Lynette's retirement account, life insurance questions, and uncertainty about beneficiaries. Those financial details remain unresolved in the source material. They should not be turned into motive without documentation. That restraint matters. A case can look suspicious without every suspicious detail being proven. The cleanest version of this investigation is not built on outrage. It is built on sequence. Abaco Inn, dinghy, Soulmate, Marsh Harbor, boatyard, GPS locations, search zones, missing objects, dental records, DNA. That is the spine, and the spine is tightening. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, Bahamian Police, and Royal Bahamian Defense Force are now working across water, land, and digital evidence. Maggie and Chris are searching terrain where scent may be difficult to detect after time in heat, humidity, and saltwater conditions. Divers and the ROV are examining places no ordinary searcher could safely clear. The question is not whether the search is serious. It is. The question is whether the search can recover enough to answer what happened to Lynette Hooker. This is where the case echoes other investigations shaped by digital trails. The source itself drew a comparison to Brian Kohberger, not because the cases are the same, but because electronic movement can become a silent witness when a person's account is disputed. And in maritime cases, that witness can be even more important. Water erases. Devices remember. That is why the GPS locations, the missing dry bag, the oar, Soulmate, and the reported 11-hour tracking gap matter so much. They are not separate mysteries. They are parts of one timeline investigators are still trying to test. If this case matters to you, the next verified development will matter more. Whether the GPS locations from Brian Hooker's devices can place him at each search site with enough precision to change the legal status of this suspected murder investigation is the question the next records still have to answer.